Great. Um, Excellent. Welcome, everyone. So excited about this. Another Ask the Professionals. Just a little bit about me. So I'm Bree Norton. I'm a co-chair of OZeWAI, but I'm also a digital accessibility specialist with AbilityWorks in Melbourne, there's a small inclusive design team. A few of my colleagues are here today to listen in because we have a WordPress site, and we're trying to improve it. So this is a very exciting topic. But as I said earlier, I've also worked in Drupal for DC.gov in the States. So across some of these content management systems, and there's some wonderful things happening in the space here to make them more accessible. OZeWAI is a not-for-profit organisation for professional membership. We used to be an annual conference, but we kind of decided we did some research over COVID. We were more of a self-help group. So, so we decided to kind of branch out and become a professional membership where we can set up mentorship benefits to other conferences that people might want to get into, and these kind of Ask the Professional events, which have been going really, really well. And we have so many amazing topics still to come. We have for OZeWAI as well, we have some resources, like we have a directory listing for Australia of how to find a professional. We also have what we call the product accessibility list, which is a bit of work we've done around procurement, where you can actually go and have a look at products or put products forward to say, are they accessible before you even go and purchase them? We have a way of scoring that, and we are always looking for volunteers to help with that. So let me know if you want to be involved in that. And I think, Mike, we've got to do a little bit more work because you're doing something in the US around that as well, I think. So I think there's some crossovers that we need to talk about. But I'm going to now hand over to the moderator today, Ricky Onsman. Thank you, Ricky. If you'd like to do an intro for yourself and then pass it around to your panelists. And really so excited to have this session today. And thank you, the two Rickies, Mike and Amber, for joining us. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Ricky Onsman. My day job is principal technical writer at TPGi, which is a global digital accessibility consultancy based in the US, but I work from home on the east coast of Australia. And I'm very pleased with this particular session. We've got people from Australia, from the USA, and from Canada, which is a pretty good effort. And particularly, I want to thank Mike because it must be midnight or something where you are.
No, it's just 10 o'clock, so it's super easy.
Okay, that's all right then. Okay.
We'll have Except I am opening for there's a Drupal event tomorrow morning that the organizers have asked me to come in first thing to help sort of set up the booth and deliver the tickets. So that was something I was not expecting. So that's it was going to make it more difficult. But that's hours away. I don't have to worry about that for at least
easy,
tomorrow.
Easy. Well, look, since you have the microphone, I might hand it over to you to just give a little bit of an introduction to yourself and what you're doing here.
That's great. Mike Gifford, I'm a Drupal core accessibility maintainer. I work with CivicActions. We're an organization that delivers a number of government services to primarily the US federal government, largely based on Drupal, but not entirely. And we're very passionate about open source and accessibility. And so I'm here because these are things that I care about and help to try and to build more awareness and to help bring more people into making the tools that we all depend on more accessible.
That's great. Yeah. And I know you're a very active advocate in that regard too. You do a lot of work on LinkedIn and a lot of work with projects, open source and otherwise. Fantastic. Amber, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Amber Hinds. I'm the CEO of a company called Equalize Digital. We focus primarily on WordPress accessibility. We have a plugin called Accessibility Checker that is a testing tool for automating accessibility testing in WordPress. I also am on the WordPress accessibility team, and I run the official WordPress accessibility meetup, which is a Zoom meetup. And what else? I'm a board president for WP Accessibility Day, which is a nonprofit conference that happens virtually, and it's a 24-hour event in October. We're going to be running October 15th through 16th this year.
Amber, you are not nearly busy enough. You need to be doing more.
And I like to join Zoom calls at 9 p.m.
Ricky Blacker, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Ricky. I will. So my name's Ricky Blacker. interesting. I'm just going to start this off. Interestingly enough, me and Ricky and Amber involved the WordPress Accessibility Day, and me and Ricky are affectionately known as the Rickies on the Zoom calls because
They have a band.
which is awesome. But yeah, so my name's Ricky Blacker. I am the head of technical services for the APAC region for a company called WP Engine. I've been with them nearly 8 years now. I was actually the second employee in Australia for the company as they branched out from their head office in Austin, Texas, very close to Amber. And yeah, I've been with them for 8 years. Before that, I was a web designer. I had my own business, and that's, I guess, where I got my passion for accessibility. I remember the first site I ever built, well, first one I got paid for a lot of money, which was a site for like a beauty wholesaler. And that was my first intro into what accessibility is all about, because I had a customer ring me up and say from one of their customers saying they couldn't see the site. And I couldn't understand why he couldn't see the words. And it was because I had blue text on a black background, which looked amazing for me, but anybody with color blindness could not see it. And that was the first step into accessibility, and it's been a passion of mine ever since, because it's something that is very underrated and not thought about very often, but it is vitally important, especially in this day and age. And so I've been, while I'm not in the same league as my other panelists and Ricky Onsman here, I don't feel like I'm as well established as them in accessibility, but I have got a passion for it, and I love spreading the word about it.
Great stuff, great stuff. And it's probably worth, I see that Bree has put the URL for WordPress Accessibility Day into the chat. Anybody here who's interested in attending, in speaking, or in sponsoring the day should follow that link and get involved. And it's worth mentioning that both Ricky and myself work on the Asia Pacific side of things. So the idea is it's a 24-hour event. So there are talks going on that are time zone friendly to Australia, Oceania, and Southeast Asia. And what we try to do is help people to give that, so that there's a representation across the globe throughout the 24 hours. So if you're at all interested in that, please do get involved. Okay, now, perhaps one of the things we could do to start off with, this topic is CMS and accessibility. Ricky, maybe I'll start with you and just ask you, what exactly is a CMS?
Good question. And it's something I had to find out for myself quite a few years ago in my intro into WordPress. A CMS is a content management system. Now, to put this in perspective, before I learned about CMSs, I was creating websites purely with HTML, CSS, with Notepad++, building out sites that way. And then I heard about this thing called a CMS, which would allow you to kind of build out sites very quickly and easily. And it's an amazing solution for building out websites. I mean, it's very normal these days. When I got into it, it wasn't as well known and well used as it is now. I think it was as WordPress. There are three main ones that I was looking at, which were open source, which was Joomla, Drupal, and WordPress. At the time, WordPress won out for me, and I went with WordPress. But basically, what it allows you to do is to go into a kind of a WYSIWYG editor, add your images and text, and be able to build out pages on a website. And the whole website experience using a software-based environment rather than, like I used to do it, completely from scratch with code. So it can speed up the process of building sites. It can allow somebody with no coding experience whatsoever to build out amazing experiences. And those who do have coding experience, they can take it to the next level. I don't know if hopefully that explains it clearly.
Yeah, that's a good explanation. Yeah. My background is actually very similar to yours in that I started out making static HTML websites as well. And when the first CMS came along, it was like a bit of a godsend. And probably one of the key things for me was getting my head around PHP, the ability to be able to put together strings of code that pulled in different sections of content and put them together. Add to that the functionality that came with a CMS, and it was kind of like, well, this is what I should be doing. This is going to make life much more easy for me. It's probably also worth mentioning at this point that pre-WordPress and other CMS, when we were working with static HTML websites, they were almost all accessible by default, simply because nothing got in the way of the HTML. It was fairly semantic then. And, the websites, a couple of them still exist that I built like in 1994. And I run accessibility checkers over them and they pass everything. So, and it's kind of like we've made things worse along the way. And I think, frankly, CMS has played a role in that. But Mike, I might get you to talk a little bit about then where Drupal comes in. How is that different to WordPress?
I was going to say, Ricky, that since you and I have been coding for as long as we have, there's some tests that wouldn't necessarily apply. Like probably in '94, you were still using Marquee and Blink because that was the popular thing at the time, and nobody tests for that these days because they haven't really been hard. Like so there's questions of that. But sorry, so I got involved in Drupal after running my own CMS. I had an open source one called Backend that I was running from about 2001 to 2000 and I guess 2006 or something. Anyways, did that before I moved to the Drupal community, and really part of it was that I was more interested in doing the technical work around this, and I didn't want to be involved in just editing other people's work and pasting it from. I didn't want to be doing essentially secretarial work of taking somebody else's work and transferring it from a Word document, which is what they would have sent it to me, to onto the web. So yeah, into code. So it was a transition process, and I realized that if I could use if I could build a content management system, I would be able to address many of those problems, and I wouldn't have to worry about the moving commas and swapping words that were the kinds of things that my clients were starting to ask for when I started my business in 1999. So it was an interesting sort of transition from that. But I think that it's interesting right now because there's a lot of flat file data, or there's a lot of challenges to content management systems. Drupal, WordPress, Typo3, the traditional content management systems are now being challenged by whether it's Hugo or Jekyll or GitHub Pages. There's these flat file tools that are really allowing developers to quickly get things up quite quickly. And so there's a movement about, well, do we need a content management system? And I think that really comes down to how do we want to support our authors, and how do we want to ensure, do we have technical authors and do we have fairly simple content? Then probably we don't need a content management system. Whereas if you've got a lot of authors and a lot of content and a lot of complexity in how you want to have your workflows done, you really don't want to be doing that in a flat file database, because then you're going to be managing the content and doing the editorial stuff as a technical person that I tried to get out of doing back when I was building content management systems by myself and a small team of people back in 2001.
Right.
That sort of answers the question.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And it's also starting to allude to a point that is raised in the chat by Florian, which is when we talk about WordPress accessibility, are we talking about the accessibility of the back end, the CMS itself, or are we talking about what's produced by the CMS, the front end of the website? Amber, would you like to dive into that a little bit?
Sure. So the WordPress accessibility team, much like I think Mike will say the Drupal accessibility team is the same way. The goal of that team, because it is a open source project, which for someone who's not familiar means that it is built by the community and anyone can view the code and anyone has the ability to do what they want with the code. It is very much focused on the accessibility of the tool itself. So that would mean the back-end editor experience. That is what the accessibility team works on. Now, that said, in WordPress, there are some themes that are put out as official themes. Each year there's one. So those would control, if you use that theme on your WordPress website, it controls the design of it, for lack of a better word. And the accessibility team will also work on that. But there's a lot of third-party themes and plugins and things that the accessibility team for the open source team would not necessarily work on. But from outside of the official team perspective, like our conference, WP Accessibility Day, is focused on making probably more frequently making the front end accessible in most of the talks when you look at the sessions there than the back end. Just because the front end typically has broader reach or implications. But there is an effort to make the editor itself accessible.
I want to go and just touch a bit, like in terms of the Drupal approach, because it is actually quite distinct from most other content management systems, and we've been at this for longer. Partly because an employee that I hired when I had my own company, he was blind, and I was able to put him on full time on addressing Drupal 7's accessibility. I'd done a lot of work with Drupal 7 and trying to make Drupal 7 more accessible at the time, but I was like, if Everett Zufeld, who's the guy I hired, could go off and, as a blind person, get involved in the community and advocate for accessibility, that would help a lot to push that issue ahead quite considerably, and it did. And one of the things that he advocated for was making sure that the back end of Drupal Drupal was accessible. And we did a lot of work for that, and Drupal's launch was actually delayed quite a bit because of the bugs that we needed to resolve and address in managing the accessibility of Drupal course accessibility. Now, that doesn't mean that all of the modules or the themes are accessible, because that's a bigger challenge. But we tried to make the core of Drupal accessible for both authors and developers. But we went a step further with Drupal 8 in that we wanted to make sure that we were looking at ATAG, which is the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines. So we wanted to support authors to create accessible content as well. This is ATAG Part B, if you're interested in looking at that sort of distinction between Part A and Part B. Most people don't even know what ATAG is, let alone what the differences are between them. But it was interesting to go off and to be one of the content management systems that really allowed ATAG to become an official standard within the WC3, because there needed to be some use cases of the demonstration of this. And it was a really interesting challenge, but it really got me into thinking about how do we make these authoring tools as helpful as possible to make sure that authors are able to get the support that they need to create accessible content.
Yeah, that's a good point. And when I raised with my colleagues that we were doing this session today, one of them threw at me the question, is there anything fundamentally wrong with having an inaccessible CMS as long as it produces accessible output? Ricky, what do you reckon?
Yeah, absolutely not. I think when we talk about accessibility, it's got to be across the board. The goal is to make, and the front end is the most visible part of the site, and that's where you want a lot of people coming to the site. But in reality, we've got a plethora of people who are using the back end to create sites. WordPress, for example, is 43% of the web. That means 43% of web developers are using WordPress, and then there's people using Drupal, Shopify, all these other Wix, all these other systems, and they need to be accessible for the front end and the back end. The creators aren't all the same, and when we're talking about accessibility, I think one of the big kind of confusions, I think, too, is a lot of people instantly go to accessibility like making it available for people with sight problems and hearing problems and mobility issues. In my mind, accessibility is everything. It's everyone. There's a analogy I like. It's like you think about accessibility in like if you had a shop front and you think, I'm going to make my shop front, my shop accessible, so I'm going to put a wheelchair ramp in so wheelchairs can get into the shop, and it'd be great. But then you're in a cold climate and it snows and people trying to walk up the ramp are slipping down and falling over, and they can't get into the shop. This is where the whole idea of accessibility, it has to be accessible to everyone, not just okay, we're going to solve this problem, because sometimes we cause more problems by trying to make it too far one way or the other, or not caring at all. And so getting back to making it accessible for the back end and the front end, we've got to make sure that everything works the way it should, that everything is not confusing, it's not working, not making it hard for anybody to use it. And that way it becomes available for everybody, and that's what it's all about. It's just accessibility for everybody. So the back end is just vitally important. Yeah.
Yeah, I might extend on that. WordPress was originally created and still has this core philosophy or ideal that it's democratizing publishing. And this is something that a lot of us on the accessibility team try to remind other contributors about, is that if you're democratizing publishing, which means making it easy for any person, any human being to publish on the web, that's the stated goal of WordPress. If the backend is not accessible, then WordPress is failing to meet its stated goal, right? Like any person should be able to install WordPress or access WordPress on whatever host they choose, open it, and figure out how to publish content. Now, does it have to look beautiful? No, because we aren't all designers on the inside, right? But the goal is that they can go write something and hit that publish button, and it will go out to the web and be available for anyone to find. Right. And so that's really where I think, you can't separate accessibility on the front end from the back end if you're trying to meet the goals. And I think a point too that's worth extending on your ramp analogy, Ricky, is that accessibility really is good for everyone. So we think of the wheelchair ramps or like the curb cuts that allow us to have a little ramp off the curb as being helpful for people in wheelchairs. But they're also super helpful when you're pushing a baby in a stroller or a shopping cart full of groceries. And accessibility on the web is very much the same way. A lot of it is just good user experience or good user interface that make things not confusing for people who would never identify themselves as disabled.
Anything you'd add to that, Mike?
I think that definitely I've been thinking a little bit about angles around personalization as well, and how there's no one person or one type of disability. There's lots of different kinds of disabilities, and it's not just about sort of meeting the needs of one person or meeting a standard. It's really trying to go out and have an effort to make sure we're meeting people where they are. And there's lots of customizations like dark mode or prefers reduced motion. A lot of CSS media queries now that are available to allow users to customize their experience to something that's my web, my way, to use the BBC or I think AbilityNet I think manages that now, the My Computer My Way program. But I did just notice also Andrew Downey's comments, and I do want to first of all just say, I'm sorry, I don't know what CMS you were using to install. There's lots of them that are difficult, and absolutely, it has been and is a challenge, and it's difficult having been involved in the Drupal community for as long as I have to even sort of, I'm not aware of the things that I don't know or that other people don't know because I've just been drinking the water for so long. And I'm sure that's the same for Ricky and Amber as well, that they're, that bringing new people in, and especially that developer experience or that initial, it's a challenge. And I do know that it's been really quite interesting to go off and have the National Federation of the Blind in the US embrace Drupal as the platform that they use for their associations. And it's, I spoke 2 years ago, I think, or 3 years ago, at their AGM, and it was really quite an interesting effort to go off and to learn from them, and also to try and find ways to bring them more into the communities, that there be more opportunities for us to have blind developers come and tell us the things that we don't know, to help it make it easier for people who are technical, but not necessarily, Drupal or WordPress or Joomla or like whatever your CMS is, to make it easier for people to get started. And it is definitely a challenge, and something that I think all open source programs struggle with, is trying to make that lower the level of entry to get people involved.
Yeah, all very true. For what it's worth, my response to my colleague was that if you have a system where you have an inaccessible CMS trying to produce accessible websites, then what you're doing is flying in the face of the fundamental principle of nothing about us without us. You're not going to involve people with disability in the creation of the websites, then you're failing. So yeah, look, all of these content management systems to some extent work on the idea of putting things together. And they can run from posts and pages, where posts carry content that is what you might call perishable, that is news oriented, that comes and goes, whereas pages carry content that is more designed to be more or less permanent. It can be changed over time, of course, but it's not intended to be time constrained. That itself sets up a dynamic that doesn't always sit comfortably with accessibility. And if you layer over the top of that the approach of a lot of content management systems of using external things to the core, add plugins for extensions, one of the issues that seems to run into with content management systems in general is that you can have an accessible core, or as accessible as it can be, and produce accessible websites. And all it takes is for one user to start using a plugin that is not accessible or doesn't produce accessible content, and you've made the entire website inaccessible. Amber, what do you think about that?
Well, they might not have made the entire website inaccessible. They might
True.
have just made like a page or a specific component inaccessible. I think, the thing that's hard about the traditional approach with web content accessibility guidelines is it's like pass or fail, and if you fail one thing, then you're not conformant. But the reality of accessibility is there's definitely a usability scale, and there are things that might not be technically conformant in all aspects, but are still generally usable and not necessarily an emergency to fix in the same way that other things are literally breaking and critical barriers.
Yeah.
But I don't think that the answer is that we can't give users the ability to control their content. What our approach has been more is that we need to educate users, and we need to do things in the editor that points them in the right direction. I think Mike can probably talk about this because I know that adding accessibility testing and guidance was a big part of Drupal 8. But even in WordPress, there are some things like in core blocks, there is a contrast when you're picking colors. It will warn you if a color that you have selected is not going to pass for color contrast. There's a view where you can see all of the headings that you've set in your core heading blocks, and it will highlight them if you've skipped a heading level. Our plugin is it does a lot on like scanning and puts a very big report right in the editor where a user is editing content, and will flag for them like 45 or more things that they potentially could have done wrong. And I think really that's the approach that I would take. It's not, okay, as a developer, we need to lock this down because we're afraid they're going to break things. I think it's more that we need to make sure that we have both the training for the content editors completed, and then we have tools available that allow them to get those reminders as they're editing content, and provide sort of that governance oversight that allows us to monitor what people are doing. That's kind of how I would look at it.
Yeah, fair enough. Mike, do you want to expand on that from your end?
I mean, one of the challenges is that with Drupal, everything on Drupal.org at this point is open source under the GPL license. So there's a consistent framing of that, and there's also a consistent tone that accessibility issues are bugs, and they're clearly bugs. This is how the model is set in core. This is what the core team has decided. And individual projects may or may not respect that accessibility issue, but the community itself has embraced the idea that accessibility issues are not feature requests, they are bugs. And that is a huge difference from most content management systems or most open source tools. The thing with WordPress in particular is that you have an open source doc, if you will, that's surrounded by a bunch of proprietary boats that allow you to go off and create your wharf. I'm pulling this analogy out of thin air, so it's probably not a very good one. But you have different captains of their ships that dock on the WordPress dock, and it means that you're in a situation where you have your own captain who is not necessarily part of the community, because they have I mean, again, this is a very biased perspective as a Drupal person coming at this from trying to figure out how this ecosystems work, and there's advantages and disadvantages to it. But it is one of those things where you can't necessarily say a unified, there's not necessarily a unified community. So if somebody doesn't want to respect the accessibility priorities, there's very little the community can do to say that if you've got a popular boat that provides a service people are demanding, that may be the one that everyone has to design around, because it is the one that this is the popular party boat, and it doesn't matter that there's no railings on it and it's completely unsafe. It's where the party's going, so that's where people want to be. And maybe that's an unfair assumption, but it is one of these challenges when you're trying to build an accessible website with these an assortment of tools that you can buy to help build what you need. And the cost of it makes a lot of sense. It's very affordable from a site purchase perspective. But if you're trying to look at a systemic perspective of how do you create a unified system that meets a consistent standard for accessibility, I'm not sure how you do that in a mixed proprietary open source environment. It's a puzzle for me, and I would love to hear what you who are more in this world think about that.
Yeah. Ricky.
Wait, so I'm curious because this is me like I don't know. In Drupal, are there not third-party developers that build Drupal add-ons?
There's people that build custom stuff, but it's not on Drupal.org. It'll be somewhere else.
Oh yeah, there's no like directory, like WordPress.org has a plugins directory and a theme directory. So you're saying Drupal doesn't have that?
We have a module directory and a theme directory, but they're just all open source. There's no proprietary options if it's on Drupal.org.
Gotcha.
And that may change because we're talking about having a marketplace for providing themes as part of Drupal CMS, which is distinct from Drupal, the CMS. But this is changing, but I think and I think that the WordPress model does have some advantages for some things, but it's also like, how do you juggle the disadvantages?
Yeah, so I'm curious, have you guys talked about this? If we add a marketplace, would we start like, I don't know, running Google Lighthouse or something like some sort of linting on it, or like Axe, right? On any theme, and if they fail, we won't allow them to go. Have you guys talked about that?
We've talked about trying to do something like that, and again, it just comes down to the energy of the volunteers to go off and to help manage and organize that process. And we I don't know if I think that there are. I mean, WordPress has a long ways. You've done so much more work at evaluating and rating themes and providing that level of accessibility. An accessibility check based on the accessibility team of the themes that are provided, and providing some recommendations for themes that push you ahead. That's really wonderful, and I think that that's something that the Drupal community does not have. But it is like there's definitely proprietary shops that are involved in building tools, and they may or may not release the content out as open source. But it's just a different area. But like, how do you conceptualize how people work together as a community?
Yeah, good stuff. Ricky, I want to ask you, when you're like building a WordPress website, do you look for plugins that are accessible or offer accessibility, or themes for that matter, and reject ones that aren't? Or do you get whatever you can get your hands on and hack it? So, let me rephrase it, customize it so that it works the way you want it to work?
Generally, and I guess it took me a long time. When I first started building out WordPress sites, I would try and find a theme that fitted what I wanted to do. So a customer would say, I want you to build a site that look like this, and I would go and find a theme that looked like that and build it out that. And that's how a lot of people do it. But what I found was, and especially if if you're doing this one-off, if you're just building a site for yourself, that kind of works. And I'm kind of getting to the point of if you question in a minute, but as an agency, like if you're doing this for customers, if you're doing this, for building out sites en masse, that doesn't work. What I eventually found was I found one theme or 2 or 3 themes that I work with solely, because what happens is you use a theme once and you come back to it 12 months later and you forget how to use it, because every theme's slightly different. They're a little bit different nowadays because they've kind of there's not as much variety in how they're kind of, but there still is. But the thing, what I was kind of getting at is that what you got to do is find a theme that we're looking at themes. That is probably one of the main important parts, because that's going to set up the whole how the site looks and feels. So finding one that is accessible and learning how to use it and keeping it, that's probably the first step. I think the biggest, whether it's themes or plugins, our biggest fault is that a lot of people put accessibility as the last step. It's like, let's build out a site, let's make it look beautiful, let's give it functionality. Oh, now we've got to make it accessible. So yeah, it really needs to be that first step when you're looking at plugins, when you're looking at themes. Is it accessible? Unfortunately, though, and this kind of comes back to the last kind of question we're talking about, there's such a plethora of themes and plugins. I think there's something like 56,000 plugins in the WordPress repository, and that's not including ones from, say, Envato and the ones out in the wild, and anything that people just custom make. And there's something like about 12,000 themes. So there's a huge choice, and there's no guidelines on how, or no enforcing of making those accessible. And testing it is the other thing too. And of course, as you start adding, the themes are the basis. And if you can get an accessible theme for a start, that's half the battle. But then your plugins, the problem is with the plugins, they're all doing different functionality, and there might be 5 different plugins doing the same sort of thing, but there's no guarantee all of those are accessible. Half the time they're not. So once again, you might have to get a plugin that is not accessible because it does what you need it to do, because it's a balancing act of getting it to do what you do. There might be 5 plugins. One might be accessible, but doesn't exactly do everything you need it to do. And it's probably going to take you more time building in the functionality of making it do what you want it to do than trying to make it accessible at the end stage. So I think while we should go forward with that, is it accessible? And be building accessibility into the site as we build it, not at the end. It's a hard thing because there's so many different options and not everything is going to be accessible. And so you just got to do the best you can. And I guess the other unfortunate thing is that for some of us, we are, and I don't consider myself to be a great coder at any length. I muddle through. I'm good enough to be dangerous, but the beauty of a lot of these CMSs is that you don't have to be a coder to use them, and that is half of the battle. Is like a lot of people don't know how to code, how to make it accessible, and that's where it gets really hard. And then we've also got plugins that promise accessibility that don't, and sometimes can make it worse. And so people think they're doing the right thing, and they get a plugin that says this plugin will make your site accessible, and it can actually go the opposite way and make it harder for people. So we've got to be really careful. I think it really comes down to things like this, and getting the word out and letting people know why it's important to have accessibility, why you should be building in from the very beginning, and then like allowing people to make the right choices going forward rather than waiting till the end and then trying to make it accessible.
I
think it'd be worth following up, if you don't mind, on Mike's question about, how do we manage that in WordPress, and the fact that we have these directories that anyone can put anything in, and there's not any accessibility oversight into it. There's only even really basic security oversight the first time you submit it. And then after that, it's a little bit more reactive security, right? Or you rely on your host to flag for you that a plugin is insecure and hey, you need to go find it. In WordPress themes, there is a optional tag that you can ask for an accessibility ready review, and that has a human actually do the assessments and say, yes, your theme qualifies to count as accessibility ready, which means that you've done some basic things. There's requirements that are listed out that I can maybe look for the links for in a minute. And we're in the process right now of trying to rewrite and modernize those because they were last updated in 2014. So as you can imagine, the accessibility ready requirements have modified a little bit since then. It's optional though. And there are lots of themes that don't choose to have that review. And honestly, if they all asked for it, we would be overwhelmed because we don't have the human volunteers to do that for free for every however many tens of thousands or more themes there are in the directory. For plugins, there is nothing. There's no way to say, I want to get an accessibility review. at WordCamp US last year, no, sorry, at WordCamp Europe last year, I had kind of an interesting conversation with Matt Mullenweg, which for people who are not familiar, he's the founder, one of the two founders of WordPress, and he runs Automatic and WordPress.com. And he was sort of pushing for there to be more automated testing in the upload process, which is via SVN. Basically, when someone pushes their code up to WordPress.org, he was initially pushing for that because the review of plugins, when someone requests to be able to list a new plugin on WordPress.org, is 100% manual right now. And there was a very, very, very large backlog, like hundreds of plugins, and people would have to wait months to be able to put it on there. But I had a conversation with him because while automated testing will not find all of the issues, it could find some very egregious issues like empty buttons or empty links or things that would make something very non-functional. And I like the idea, and I'm like, well, if you're going to lint for security, and every time someone pushes an update to their plugin, or you're going to lint for whatever else, let's do that for accessibility and run acts against it or some other open source rule set, and have public badges on the plugin listing that says accessibility pass or accessibility fail. And then that would give all of the site owners the ability to make that choice. They would see, okay, this plugin passes for WordPress coding standards, it passes for security, it passes for accessibility. Maybe this is what I'm going to look at. Now, would it be perfectly accessible? No, but it would certainly differentiate the ones that have major problems, and save a lot of users' time. Because like you were saying, Ricky, sometimes it's trial and error. You spend a bunch of time just trying 5 different plugins, and wouldn't it be great if you could just look at the page and, say, oh, we're not going to try this one because I already know right here it fails. So I think there are ways to handle this when you have an open source marketplace that still allows a lot of freedom to anyone, even people who, are using ChatGPT to code their stuff and don't really know what they're delivering, to submit something. I don't know where that is right now. I think a lot of stuff in WordPress is sort of up in the air, but I think there are ways that can be handled in a CMS open source community that would put more focus on accessibility for everyone.
Yeah. My own approach has been from the start, since I started using WordPress, I could see the value of having complete themes that people would just be able to install and have to do very little to, and it would create a good look and a website that works. That defeated my favorite activity, which is customizing stuff and hacking it and making it work the way I want it to work. So I've always used themes that were pretty much blank canvas as much as possible. They provide the basic functionality, but you do all your own styling. And they come with a child CSS file so that everything is stored separately from the main parts of the theme. So when you update the theme, your changes aren't lost. And that also affords the opportunity to make things more accessible. Because if you can do all the styling yourself, you can do a lot of the way towards making sure that everything is accessible. I've had less success with that with plugins, in that whenever I hack a plugin, it stops working. But what I did find was useful was that most of the time, you know who makes the plugin. And I've gone with, there was a guy who produced a very good date picker. It was fantastic. It worked very well, except it wasn't keyboard accessible. And so I contacted him direct and said, look, if you made this keyboard accessible, you'd be a much more popular plugin. A lot more people would get it. And he did. So he made a keyboard accessible, and I had to give him a little bit of advice about how, but he did it, and that's one of the nice things about kind of the borderline between open source and proprietary. You can actually approach people who produce proprietary products and ask them to modify it and make it more accessible. And I find most people are very open to that. They go, well, yeah, that's going to help me sell more, especially if they're charging for it. So that's a kind of an interesting thing there.
I've seen in the WordPress space, at least, a huge push on accessibility among more of the larger, but the commercial WordPress plugins, particularly driven by the European Accessibility Act. So I don't know if you've seen that same thing in the Drupal community, that's been motivational.
There's definitely been there's certainly been some initiative in that area. I don't think it's been a huge drive because Drupal's has come quite a long ways already, and there's certainly more that can be done. But it's quite good as it is, as at least in terms of the core code base and the popular modules that are being used. Not that there isn't still a lot more to be done, but in terms of most sites meeting those requirements, it's not a huge challenge for Drupal sites to meet that out of the box. But I was thinking about about some of the challenges we're coming up with, and I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about the challenge of automated testing for even something like the core of either WordPress or Drupal, and how do you do that, and how do you provide that testing framework, and how do you make sure you're doing something in a way that is done in a CI/CD fashion, like continuous integration, continuous development. How do you make sure you're able to go off and to keep this vibrant so that you're able to catch issues as early as possible, as Ricky was saying earlier, shift left. And it is a real problem because there are different tools. Like we worked with Nightwatch and had built something with Nightwatch that worked okay, wasn't as flexible, and a lot of our community was using Cypress. There's other tools as well that allow for that type of dynamic testing, but it does something. It's not a trivial thing to set up and to maintain. And there's a lot of places like, how do you even know what aspects of a user interface a plugin affects? That isn't always something that's visible. Either in Drupal or in any open source module. You'll have a project that may have no impact to the user interface, so it may not have any accessibility implications at all. And then there's other pieces that have it in a weird, unique place that is not necessarily going to be tested. But I think that there are big challenges that groups of open source communities like Drupal, WordPress, Typo3, can be involved in. There's something called the Open Web Alliance that was set up a couple of years ago, based on the European Union's efforts to deal with copyright issues, and I forget what the concern was, but there was an effort to build a unison of the big open source content management systems to say, how do we work together? And I think that they're taking on some of these bigger challenges like accessibility, sustainability, even performance, issues of documentation. Like there's a lot of struggle with the same kinds of problems. They're unique in their expression, but they're common in terms of how do you find a solution. And because there is this open source base for the work that we do, there is an opportunity to share and collaborate effectively across all of our communities and be able to experiment. Like when you were talking about the color contrast checker that you've built in WordPress that identifies when there's a bug when you pick a color that's the incorrect, that doesn't have sufficient contrast. That's amazing. Drupal doesn't have that. How do you set that up in your CMS? You're able to do that, like that type of thing. I mean, in some ways, it's not that difficult, but it is more complicated within a system. And Steve Christie mentioned earlier about the templates. I'd say that they're often the problems don't come from the templates themselves. The templates are generally fairly they're usually in fragments, at least in Drupal. You're not dealing with a whole page. You're dealing with here's this part of this page or this section of a page. Like there may be 100 or more templates that are involved in generating a specific page in Drupal. So it's a different kind of thing when people think about the pages and templates. There are different. But as far as AI, like there is definitely potential, but I don't know that I've seen certainly no real impact right now where I've seen a dramatic increase in the accessibility of the content, or of the code itself, of the output. Like I am quite hopeful about the alt text, especially, but there's a few other areas where I think AI can start to make a big advantage in the content, in the work that's generated through the authoring tools. But it hasn't made a big change that I've seen so far into making sure that the templates themselves are as accessible as possible.
Yeah. Before we go too far down the AI wormhole, which could take us hours, there's a question that was raised in the chat that I think is quite interesting from Steve Christie. It says, while React is a very popular IDE for enterprise scale applications amongst developers, it's notorious for producing invalid and inaccessible semantic HTML. As a result, there's now a push to have alternative IDEs that are set up to produce valid HTML first. Are there such things emerging in the CMS space, and especially for systems like SharePoint? Anybody want to jump in on that?
I don't know if any of us could speak about SharePoint.
Well, we can say, well, why would you use SharePoint? There is that as a fundamental question. Like, why? Just why?
Wrong
Well,
CMS.
there are some houses where it's a Microsoft house. At TPGi, we use Teams. Everybody complains about it, including people with disabilities who find it inaccessible in lots of ways. We use SharePoint. We complain about that and the inaccessibility of it. But in some cases, that's you order down. No, that's what we're using. That's what you got to use. So it then becomes, what can we do to make this more accessible, either on our own, acting on our own behalf, or by going to Microsoft Teams and saying, what about you do this? But in general, apart from SharePoint, is there like a push in CMS to make things accessible first? Do you sense that? Ricky, what do you reckon?
Honestly, at the moment, I think there is demand for it, and there is a push, but it's not happening, and not the way that we want it to. I think that's my personal feeling. I think, and some of it is because it's like the big elephant. It's you're trying to eat an elephant, and people are looking at it going, it's too hard, because accessibility is such a broad thing. And how do we check for it? How do we do that? Like, there's certain checks, like Amber was saying earlier, like about, we could have checks as people push code up and we can check, but it's not going to be a true check of accessibility. And we've also got to be careful that people don't get this false sense of, oh, this is accessible now. That's the other big part of this problem, is that it's not just a simple matter of, oh, I've ticked the box and it's accessible. And that's where we've seen the issues with these accessibility overlays and plugins that, do things that say, oh, this is going to make your website accessible. And people go, oh, I've ticked the box, it's accessible now. And then the website actually isn't. We've got to be careful that we don't give that false sense of security to people, that there's still a lot to be done. So I think that's the hard part. It's how do we tackle this problem? But I think we shouldn't give up on it. We should be working towards it and just finding, once again, it's a big elephant to devour. We need to just be taking small bites and chipping away at it to make it happen. But there's so many other components, because when we talk about IDEs and things, you got, like if you're doing hard level coding, you're using, coding programs, and a lot of that will be checking for PHP errors and coding errors and all that kind of stuff, but it's not checking for accessibility. But having that built in could be the first step.
Yeah.
I
guess
think
there's
on
a
the
thing there
React
too.
note.
Go ahead, Amber.
Oh, I was just going to say, on the React note, I think one of the challenges that has happened in WordPress as a CMS is that the main editor, which is now called the block editor in core WordPress, it's based on a tool called Gutenberg, which is its own separate open source project. And that is built on React, whereas traditional WordPress was all PHP. And one of the challenges that the WordPress accessibility team had is that not many people on the accessibility team are actually React developers. And so it can be very challenging to patch bugs. We had a really great team rep for a number of years who is a very strong React developer and is also blind. So that was great, but he stepped out of the team. And, when you lose that and then you're saying, okay, well, we don't have a lot of React developers, it makes it really hard to continue the accessibility front, just because the learning curve for that is a lot higher than, learning how to do PHP to fix problems.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely challenges with choosing certain languages. And then extending that as well, if you're trying to decide what CMS to use, if you have to create custom components for it, you definitely want to know that you're going to be able to edit them. Or you're in a situation where you might need to hire a developer to help you resolve some accessibility issues because you don't have the skills or the desire to fix them. So I think that's definitely a challenge in the WordPress space right now.
I think as an addendum to that, I've certainly had React developers say to me that it's not so much a matter that React produces inaccessible code, it's that it's not designed to by default, but it doesn't stop anybody making stuff accessible. It doesn't get in the way of accessibility. It just doesn't have it built in. So the React developer has to come with accessibility know-how in order to make it accessible. And I think that's a valid point, but it also ignores the fact that an awful lot of React developers don't have that built into their training, right? And I guess
I think that's
yeah. Go ahead, Mike.
I think that is a cop out from the React community, because you can set up defaults that meet accessibility requirements. Like your basis should be, let's make it accessible by default. Let's make sure that we've got examples, at least of the examples that you're providing. Like when I was looking, I started working on Drupal's accessibility back in 2009, and I wasn't the only one, but was definitely the most tenacious of the people that were working to go off and improve the accessibility of this content management system. And we did work to go off and make it, as one of our goals, accessible by default. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Is it the most accessible content management system out there? From a very biased perspective, I think it is. But I think it is a real challenge, and we did want to go off and make sure that we're looking to say, let's provide good examples. Let's provide defaults. Let's try and make sure that we're living up to this, so that somebody who has no experience, who just goes with the defaults that we give them, is going to get a good experience. You shouldn't need to be an accessibility expert to go off and produce a reasonably accessible website if you're just using simple tools. And I think that's something that I believe strongly in. But we also, like most of us here, I think, are from what I've been able to see, are probably business involved in some level of business. And I think that the part of that is sort of realizing that we need to shape the incentives. And I've gotten much more involved in procurement recently, because I realized that in order to go off and get clients to be asking for things that I need, that we need to have in the Drupal community, we need to have our clients be asking for it and demanding it. And if it isn't a priority for our clients, it's not going to be a priority for us as business owners. Because if it is, we're not going to be in business for long. So it's trying to go up and get them to value the work of accessibility, build that into their procurement, build that into their defaults, so that you're not going to have to luck out to find a client who happens to care about accessibility and therefore is willing to pay for premium services to develop a higher quality website. You're going to find somebody who's going to say, you're not even viable to bid on this contract because your own website is so inaccessible. Just doing a simple test, like all I did was look at your website with accessibility insights, saw a whole ream of errors to it, and I'm not even going to look at your RFP, your response to our RFP, because it's clear you clearly have no idea what you're doing with accessibility. Like, we need to try and build systems so that our clients are asking for the things that we want them to be asking for in order for this to be a priority.
Yeah, well put. Mm-hmm. Amber, you mentioned that you chatted with Matt Mullenweg, and I was almost delighted to see that yesterday he came out with a proposal that is like almost brilliant fodder for this particular panel, which is the idea of a canonical accessibility plugin for WordPress. Would you be able to explain what he meant by that and what you think of it?
Yeah, so there was an article that was published yesterday, your time. It's so funny. It's still today here. But actually, this website author, I posted a link in the chat if anyone wants to read it. She's in Australia. So I went here earlier today and I saw an article that's published on May 2nd. So like in the future. But his comment was actually a couple of weeks ago. And so she published this article just yesterday. Because of a lot of things that aren't worth going into, the releases on WordPress are going to be slowing down. And he had proposed that certain things might be better handled in what's called in WordPress a canonical plugin, which means a plugin that is supported by the community. It's open source. It's not proprietary or just like owned by one company. And usually these are ways for people to test things that might be suggested as features to be added into WordPress core. So there's like a performance one. Gutenberg is a plugin that's also considered like a canonical plugin where you can get that has things that don't exist in WordPress core yet. There's like some security enhancement plugins and things like that. It was suggested by him that it might be useful to just make accessibility a canonical plugin, which means WordPress core itself would not have accessibility as a focus, but instead accessibility would get added to WordPress when you install the accessibility plugin. Obviously, there's a lot of concerns about this. It's something that myself and some other people on the accessibility team or who have previously been on the accessibility team have spoken out about, which is what this article is about. Because, you know, if accessibility is no longer considered core to WordPress, I think, you know, like many of the things we've already discussed, I don't think WordPress is meeting its value of democratizing publishing. I also think it makes it a CMS that's a lot less attractive to government and higher ed and large enterprise organizations that know that they have to purchase accessible IT. And then what does that do for the CMS itself? Because you're losing out on people who would have potentially contributed things to the community because they were using it on their own website and they're like, hey, I need to build this feature. Maybe I should submit it to core, or I should build a free plugin that I can release. Well, those people are no longer going to be giving back because they're going to be giving back to Drupal, right? Or something like that. So there are a lot of concerns about this making accessibility a feature plugin rather than just something that's built in. I also just think it doesn't make sense. I don't know why you'd build every component twice. Like, we're going to build the component and then we're going to build the accessible version of the component. It makes no sense to me. Especially when we're constantly talking about not having enough contributors.
What is the use case for having a version of WordPress without accessibility? Like, how does that make?
I mean, I think I cannot speak for what is in his head, but I do think that there are some perceptions, and this is not just among WordPress leadership. I think this is something we have to struggle with all the time with clients or people just out in the space, that accessibility slows down development. And I expect that that's probably one of the things here, which is just thinking it's not necessarily that we're against accessibility, but we want to be able to release things the moment we've thought of them and we've sat up all night coding them before having QA, right? Now, all of us here on this panel would probably say that's a horrible idea. But there are, I think, a lot of developers out in the world that are kind of like, yeah, I don't care. I just want to build the thing and I want to ship it. So.
Is there going to be a canonical security plugin?
I think there is actually already one that does extra things. There's one, I know that there's a canonical plugin that allows you to do two-factor authentication, because that's not built into WordPress. And that is a security feature. But some people would argue not every website needs two-factor authentication. You know, if it, I don't know. I'm a little bit like, no, you probably do. But there are people that might argue that. And so they're like, let's not put it in WordPress core. We just make it a plugin that the community supports. People who want it can install and activate it. I think the biggest challenge with also having accessibility as a plugin is there are a lot of times people who don't know they need the accessibility feature that would really benefit from it. And so what will happen is somebody might install WordPress core, and unless their host has said, okay, everyone needs the accessibility plugin, we're going to install this by default, which hosts can do. What's going to happen is in some scenarios, people will install WordPress core, not be able to use it or not be able to use certain parts of it, and they will churn instantly because they might not even know what to search for. You know, and so I just don't feel like it's in the best need. I don't know. Ricky, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying, because it's doubling up on the, you know, this is something that should be fundamentally part of WordPress or with any CMS. Having it as a canonical, you know, even though canonical sort of implies that it's should be used, it's still an option, and it's still it means we're not going to be seeing those features put into the actual WordPress core, and that's where it needs to be. Yeah, I totally agree, and I think we just need to totally go away from that idea and just focus on making it part of core, making it part of WordPress. If accessibility was SEO, it, it would, things like that, like SEO, whenever people look at building out websites, SEO is probably one of the biggest things to look at, and they'll throw millions of dollars at it, but accessibility seems to be always on the back burner. It should be on. It's probably better for SEO than half the things we do for SEO. So I think we just need to keep pushing that agenda and getting it part of. I can kind of see why Matt wants to do it that way, but it's definitely not the right way.
So
Andrew asked, "What is SEO?"
Yeah, that's search engine optimization. But I also want to get to his previous comment, which is about writing. Like, I think personally that writing quality code takes longer. It doesn't matter if you're a good developer or not. It takes longer to go off and write quality code, and that applies to security or accessibility or whatnot. And certainly, if you're, I think that matters. We need to be willing to pay more to have quality code, because we've got somebody who's considering it and thinking about it. And that it doesn't matter how good a developer you are, you have to care and take the time to make sure you're doing it properly.
So I kind of want to push back on this writing quality code takes longer, only because, and I know we said we weren't going to go down the AI rabbit hole, but if you were a really good prompt engineer, you can get very accessible code written for you by some things that are AI included for available for free. I think what takes longer is testing it and confirming that it did a good job. But I mean, I'm not very good at JavaScript. And the other day I had ChatGPT write me JavaScript that would patch, it would turn what were link accordions with no aria into accordions that had button semantics and aria to explain if they were expanded or collapsed, and could function with the spacebar and all that. Now, I would never be able to have written that myself, but I went in, I said, here's all the HTML. Write me JavaScript I can put in the footer of a website that will have it do all of these things. It gave it to me. Initially, it used actual buttons, and then I went back and I said, this breaks too much. I don't want to have to rewrite all the CSS. Use role equals button and add spacebar support instead, right? So and then I tested it, and there was something else that didn't work, so I had to go back and forth a little bit. But it wrote all the code for me. So I don't know if it's necessarily, I mean, obviously it's faster if you have it memorized, but how many of us actually have all that? How many times have you been there's a CSS class for this, but I don't, or a CSS command for this, but I don't remember what it is. You Google it or you go to Stack Overflow, right?
I mean, it's not that it isn't.
It's the testing that takes longer, but if you are experienced enough to know what the output should be, I don't think it's hard writing accessible code.
And I think also that I think that it comes from the fact that people look at accessibility at the last stage. This is the biggest problem, is that it seems like it takes longer because people build out a site and then go, oh, I've got to make it accessible. And it seems like it slows the process down because now you're fixing problems rather than making accessible part of the process of building the site out. Because if you do that, then it's
even
just
before you start building in your design. Right?
I remember when I first started building websites and got into WordPress, and we just started getting mobile phones that could display websites, and there was this massive push for mobile first development. The idea was to build a website for a mobile phone first, and then add all the extra stuff onto it to make it look good on a big screen. And because generally, before then we had monitors, and we built websites for monitors. And then when as mobile phones came out, we found that building websites for monitors was not very good for mobile phones. So there was this big push of, let's build it for the mobile phone first, and then we can expand it for the big screens. And now we have to design websites that will go on smartwatches up to 4K TV screens, and everybody was fine with that, and that was it was a big thing of development. I want to see that with accessibility. Let's make let's design for accessibility first, and then add in your embellishments at the end. And then it's not as much of a task. It's not going to slow down the process. It's going to make the process faster in some ways.
Yep.
The problem is that all of the contributors who build the CMSs need to learn and build the habit of testing for accessibility as they build. Just like you're saying, I'm sure all of them look at it on a smaller screen before they submit that PR. I hope they do, or they maybe look at it in a different browser before they submit that PR. They need to build the habit of turning on their screen reader, installing one if they don't have one, and tabbing through and listening to it. And once you start doing that really early and often, you just learn. My partner, Steve, will say a lot. He's like, if it's not accessible, it's broken. And he just built he's like, I don't accept code that, it can't be committed to the main branch if it's not accessible.
Although, I mean, what we recommend in terms of process isn't starting with screen readers. In fact, because sighted people have trouble understanding how a blind user actually uses a screen reader, I'm not sure that it's an effective test in many ways, because the experience you're getting is very different as a sighted user that's built the site. You can figure out how a individual component works and can you navigate through that, but it's a different experience. So we recommend that people start using tools like Accessibility Insights, which has some really excellent guidance for automated testing, but it also has really strong guidelines for how to go through and do manual testing. And it has a checklist there that you can then export. The thing that's best about Accessibility Insights, I find, is the ability to go off and to take an issue and to copy and paste information from that into your Jira ticket or whatever your ticket tracking system is, that another user can replicate the problem. Because that's one of the hugest problems with accessibility, is how do you make sure that you can replicate the problem. But once you've gone through and done the work with Accessibility Insights, providing that testing with a third-party tool, and with you go through and do the manual testing, can you tab through it? And if you can catch those two issues, you're going to catch most of the accessibility issues. Not everything, but most of them. And then looking to say, well, if you've got a pattern you're not familiar with, does anyone else gone off and who's an accessibility expert posted some ideas around how to deal with this component? Or is there stuff that we can pull from the WC3 or from Eric Bailey or Adrian Roselli, or there's people like Carl Groves who've written so much helpful, wonderful advice around best practices in the web. Is there some example that we can use to say somebody else has tested this and evaluated this, so that you can find a good example? And I do think I do want people to go off and to be cautious about the use of AI in developing code, because it can develop code and absolutely can develop code that works. I've done a bunch of this developed code that works, but I'm not going to go off and say it's developing good code. I'll say it develops code that works. And sometimes it does it the way I want, and sometimes it doesn't quite do it the way I want. And you have to know enough to know, is this good quality code or not, in order to be able to make a judgment on that. But sometimes it's just like, well, does it work or not? And if it works and satisfies your use case, that might be sufficient for most people to say, okay, it's good enough to go. But I do think that it is, we're at a point where we have to go off and look at the tools that we're using, and not just take code and say, does it work? But try and find how and why, and how do we try and especially when you're putting something in production. It's a whole different thing if you're using this in your own site. But if you're putting something in production, to go off and and again, with the modification you're adding, Amber, that's not a big deal either, because it's just it's taking something isn't accessible and making it more accessible. So you can test that functionality, that works, right? But it's just the general challenge of can we use AI to write code for us and trust that? It's well, trust but verify. You have to verify.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely testing.
There, if I can. That first of all, when we at TPGi, when we test on a screen reader, we use the JAWS in a default setting. Then when we get our people who actually use JAWS, we get very different results because hardly anybody uses the default settings. They all customize it to what they need the most, and it has an endless array of customizations, of verbosity, all kinds of things. So we get constantly different results. The other thing we've done is we've set up our own AI engine, a knowledge-based assistant, and that is trained on all the audits we've ever done, all the rules we've ever written, all the blog posts we've ever published. And that kind of cuts down a lot of the blather. So we get ones that we feel are authentic results because they're based on our own work over time. Nevertheless, we still have the confounding incidents of you ask a question, you get a result. You ask the same question, you get a completely different result. How is that even possible?
I mean, doesn't AI still not always accurately tell you what the day is? Or like how many R's are in the word strawberry or something like that?
Yeah, and they constantly apologize. Say, I'm sorry, you wanted the best piece of JavaScript code. Oh, that's this. Ask the same question. Oh, I'm sorry, you wanted the best ever piece of JavaScript code. So it's got a long way to go.
Really,
even when you have
what it comes down
over what it's trained on.
I think what it really comes down to is accessibility is always a layered approach. So, you're doing whatever sort of linting you do in wherever you're writing code on your local machine. You probably have linting on your PRs. I know we use CodeRabbit for that. And what is it? Gemini? Whatever you get with GitHub for free. Axe also can do linting on PRs depending on what kind of repo you're working on. If it's a public and a personal repo. And then you've got manual testing that has to happen. You might do automated testing on the built code because whatever you did in linting is not a rendered result, right? And then, that's I think where Mike's accessibility insights come in is on the rendered result, I think, or our accessibility checker plugin is the same thing. It's a rendered result. And then beyond what you're talking about, Ricky, after, all of the manual testing by accessibility experts or QA people, you ought to really pull in users and do user testing because that's going to give you more of a real world result. And so I think broadly, you just need to think about as a layered approach and figure out how to fit that into your workflow.
Yeah.
I had to throw in the article.
Go ahead, Mike.
I wrote this article with Kate on Kozlavich on for Smashing Magazine a few years back and talking about the layered approach, and absolutely that's a great way to think about it, and I just wanted to bring that in there.
Yeah. Look, we're coming to the end of it, but there is a very good question here that I think each of you probably will provide a slightly different answer to. Since one of the biggest advantages of using a CMS is that non-developers can add content to the website, what strategies do you have for helping content editors and graphic designers produce accessible content beyond what the front-end theme can do? Ricky, would you like to tackle that?
Thanks for throwing me in first.
Oh, that's okay.
And just to be fair, I haven't been really on the tools for a long time, but I guess, look, it's all about education. I mean, I'd like to see more prompting built into CMSs to help people. And we're starting to see that, as Amber was saying earlier, we've got in WordPress now, it will tell you if you are using, two colors that are going to not contrast properly and cause issues, which I would have loved when I first started because that was one of my biggest issues was having, it looks great on the screen, but, somebody's color blindness can't see a word. But there's lots of things. I think even just a simple prompt, if you haven't added an alt text to an image or something like that, could be really helpful. That's one of the big things. People throw images in left, right, and center, and apart from making them, 20 megabytes, they'll forget to do any of the alt text or anything like that. But also knowing when not to add alt text to an image can be important as well. So it comes down, it's really hard to make this an automated experience. I think it just comes down to education of your content creators. But yeah, definitely I'd like to see some more prompts in the back of all the CMSs to allow, because this is the big thing. I mean, it's in the title, content management system. It's all about the content. It's about creating content. And a lot of, WordPress and Drupal, can be used for blogging and, sharing stories as well as, just simple websites. But having ways to prompt people on what's right and what's wrong and why they shouldn't be doing this. It's a long ways to go, but it's going to be a kind of a mixture of prompts and education from people like us, I guess.
Good answer. Amber, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, this is literally why we built our accessibility checker plugin, because we would deliver accessible websites and they would come back and not be accessible. So having the automated reports right in there, we've had a lot of people who switched from using like a site improve or a similar tool because they found that their content editors didn't go to the external website and look at the reports. So I think it's really important for CMSs to build this in. The other thing that we have done a little bit of and are exploring different options is having the ability to guide people by restricting choices. So a feature that we have right now in Accessibility Checker that site administrators can do is they can block the ability for users or users of certain user roles to upload PDFs. Because in higher ed, at least, this becomes a major problem. PDFs have to be accessible too. And if you give every faculty member the ability to upload a PDF, suddenly you can find yourself in trouble with the Department of Education because you have 5,000 inaccessible PDFs. So doing things like that. We've been sort of playing around with, do we have the ability to limit the heading levels that can be selected based on knowing what heading level precedes the new heading block that has been inserted into the page? So if you have an H2, there's literally no reason why the heading block should offer you the ability to insert an H6. So we've been trying to do some things like that where it can intelligently interpret what is on the page and then only give people accessible choices. I've seen some exploration on this from University of Illinois with the CK editor, which is a WYSIWYG editor. I don't know if you've seen that, Mike, some of the things that they've done on this same front with really like restricting what is available in the editor, which is kind of inspirational. It's more challenging in the WordPress block editor than it is in CK editor.
Well,
but
even that, I mean, it's all built for CK Editor 4. CK Editor 5 came out, and that plugin no longer exists.
And now it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. So, and now I'm in regular contact with the CK Editor people, CK Editor folks, to say, how do we bring this functionality in? This should be the default functionality that you're using, because you're absolutely right. If you've got an H3, you should by no means ever be presented with the option of having an H6. And that's just how it should be out of the box. You might be able to have an alternate setting that allows you to do stupid things, but the default should allow you to go off and at least constrain the options so that people are not using the heading structure to go off and to denominate something other than structural meaning, because that's what it's there for. And yeah, taking stuff away is absolutely a good thing. I was going to mention the Ali First plugin because that's the one that John Gunderson from the University of Illinois was managing. But in terms of like, I'm presenting tomorrow at Drupal Camp Ottawa a presentation talking about a Drupal CMS and AI, and I do think that there is a real advantage in where Drupal is heading right now to be able to, as soon as you've got an AI provider established within Drupal, you can enable an alt text plugin that does a very good job of taking those images and giving you a default for your author to review and then publish. And so it's a very smooth process that is I think a really excellent example for other CMSs to go up and to build on. Another tool I'll be trying to highlight is the ability to go off and modify tone. And again, writing in plain language, it's really simple in theory, but people don't follow content style guides. They really have a hard time. We think that plain language is going to be simple, but it's really complicated. Even as an accessibility person, it's hard to go off and write, in plain language. It's hard to write alt text. Like that is something like I care about alt text, but I've scanned. It's hard for me to write alt text, and I know that when I've scanned government websites around the world, a lot of them have really shitty alt text. What's up there is really, really low quality information, and certainly not something that you would want to be able to substitute for the image that's there. But I think that the AI alt text with human review and oversight is a great way to go up and to help make it easier for authors to be able to take that next step and be able to have a more accessible by default image creation process.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, I can vouch for the Equalize digital accessibility checker. I use it on my own website, and I find it incredibly frustrating. I keep putting up things that I think, this will get it. No, they found something. Damn it.
I don't know if that is a good testimonial or a bad testimonial. We got a review once on WordPress.org. It was a 5-star review, but it said, this plugin will make you want to go ask for a refund on the commercial theme that you just bought. It will tell you how bad it is. And I was like, I don't know if that's
for participating in the panel today. It was absolutely excellent. I think a lot of people got a lot of stuff out of this. And all you people watching, I want to encourage you to, if you're not already a member of OZeWAI, please consider joining. It's something that we keep doing these sessions. They will be available on video, but we have a lot of interesting topics coming up. And I might throw over to Bree now to tell you about them.
Excellent. Oh, what a great discussion. And again, the hour and a half just goes flying past. Such wonderful messages and resources shared and lots of discussion. And obviously from a variety of different aspects as well. So yeah, it's come up with a few more topics for us for our professionals: AI, accessibility, SharePoint, Microsoft. Make accessibility great again. I love it, Steve. Thanks. So we're going to have to start promoting that one. Look, just to finish up, thank you, Amber, Mike, Ricky, and Ricky. Wonderful session. We've got our June session coming up where we're going to actually have a meetup, a national meetup for OZeWAI. We've invited our Perth web accessibility organisers. I run the Canberra one, and we've also got Rosie from Tasmania. Ricky, I've reached out to you. I think I'd love for you to moderate that one again. So if you'd like to have a think about that. And we've reached out to Sydney and Melbourne. So just trying to get an idea of, we're such a big country, and, we do love our local meetups and, how supportive and what do we get out of them? What are the benefits? So please consider joining OZeWAI, because we're also trying to support most of those local meetups on the ground as well, even though we don't run our own conference anymore. We also were very proud to sponsor World Accessibility Day last year, and we'll be in touch to see how we can promote that again, because that to us is a wonderful way for us to get across to members of what we're doing. And thanks again. And keep an eye out. Again, Ricky does a wonderful job on the newsletter. Amazing material, amazing information, and we're building up more of that resources on our website as well. We are doing more advocacy work as well. We've sending off letters to ministers about advocating for a digital accessibility apprenticeship. They have one in the UK that's just going gangbusters, and I know there's one that's happening in the US, it's the state of California and across there. So we're a bit behind, and we do need to build up our education and digital accessibility. So supporting OZeWAI will support that advocacy as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day or evening for Amber and Mike. And we'll see you next time for the next Ask the Professionals. Subscribe to the newsletter to get all the news. Thanks all.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye for now.
Thank you.